Good evening. There we go. We are glad to see everyone out this evening on a dry, pretty evening. It is somewhere probably, I guess, but we're glad you're here and glad for the time that we get to spend fellowshipping with each other and studying in God's Word. If you'll be opening up your Bibles to the book of Mark, is where we are continuing our study. And we, of course, spent the last couple of weeks on the section that I told you was really the hub of the entire Gospel of Mark. And we spent so much time on just a few short verses because it is so vital to understand what's going on. As I mentioned, I've really talked about this all along, but especially we talked about a couple of weeks ago when we got into that section, how that everything leading up to the end of Mark chapter 8 was focused on proving that Jesus was the Messiah. So you had the vast majority, 20 of the 26 miracles in that first half of the book. You had that constant continuation, that cycle of Jesus performing those miracles. There would be some sort of opposition. The scribes and the Pharisees who wanted to it seemed like that's all they wanted to do was argue and fuss. And then Jesus would have a teaching section after that. And of course, again, all of that was to prove that Jesus was the Messiah, that Jesus is God the Son, that He's the one that they've been waiting for and looking for. And then from this point on, everything is focused towards the cross, and keeping in mind what, that revelation that we saw in chapter 8. Of course, you remember the miracle of the man that was healed twice, and the point of that being that when he first was healed, he couldn't see clearly. He could see a little bit, but couldn't see clearly, and then the second time Jesus healed him, he was completely healed. And we talked about the fact that it wasn't that Jesus messed up when He was healing him and didn't heal him good enough, but that the point of that particular miracle was to show the disciples, you're not seeing clearly yet, but if you'll just stick with me, then eventually you'll see things very clearly. Well, then, Jesus asked the disciples, who do men say that I am? It was Peter, as is often the case, that makes that bold statement of, you're the Christ, you're God the Son, you're the Messiah, you're the one that we've been waiting for. But yet we talked about how that even though Peter answered the question correctly, he didn't really get it right because Peter doesn't understand fully what he's saying at that point. And the mindset of the fact that the Messiah is here to sit on David's throne, to kick the Romans out, to make Israel a great and mighty nation, that the Messiah is going to rule and to reign on this earth over the kingdom of Israel, is clearly what he has in mind, because here in this second half of the book, we talked about how that we have these suffering statements over and over again. And after the first of those, when Jesus said that He would be arrested, He would be persecuted, He'd be put to death and be raised on the third day, Peter says that's not the way it's supposed to happen, And Jesus had to rebuke Peter for that. Again, he gets that He's the Messiah, he gets that He's sent from God, he gets that He's the anointed king. But he's still wanting Jesus to be the king that He wants Him to be, rather than to fall under the rule and reign of the Messiah and be the follower of the king that He is. He's still not seeing clearly. And so as we continue forward tonight, before we get into the text or even really set kind of the scene for all that, I want you to think about, you've probably seen before if you're on social media, or if you're one of those husbands that just uses your wife's social media account and pretends that you're not on social media, or maybe you've seen it in some sort of questionnaire or in a game. I was actually asked this one time in a job interview. But maybe you've been asked the question before, if you could have supper with 3 people, living or dead, who would you choose? Who would you pick? Who would you pick? Corey, is that what you said? No. Huh? Who would you pick? Whoever's going to pay. That's as Johnny a Vincent an answer as I've ever heard. I want to eat with Johnny because he's going to make sure there's going to be somebody there to pay for us. Who would you want to eat with? Jesus? Who else? Moses, Peter, Adam. After the sermon Sunday night, you might want to have supper with Eve and say, what were you thinking? And maybe you've thought of maybe some non-biblical people, Abraham Lincoln or Christopher Columbus or John F. Kennedy or whoever it might have been. Well, in our text that we're going to study tonight, if you were a Jewish person in the first century, I would dare say that the top 3 people that would be on your list of people you would want to sit down and eat supper with would probably be Moses and Elijah, and the only one that I would add to that list that's not in our text tonight is maybe David would be the third one that they would want to throw in there. Maybe Abraham. But that's what's going to go in our text tonight. Of course, we've already kind of set the scene of where we've been, but the Transfiguration is the next section that we want to look at that begins in chapter 2 of verse 9. Now, one of the dangers, we talk about this all the time, one of the dangers of seeing, as you're reading through in your Bible, and you see that big 9 at the heading of this chapter is to think, well, we've stopped talking about all of that and we've moved on to something else. But keep in mind that that's only been the last few centuries that we've had those chapter breaks in there. Originally, this continued in the flow of thought. So don't lose sight of what's gone on. Peter has said, you are the Christ, the Son of God, but he's still not seeing clearly what's going on. So when we get into the Transfiguration, which if you're someone who's grown up in church and going to Bible classes, is probably an account that's pretty familiar with you, just simply because it's such an amazing account in the life of Jesus where God is trying to help the disciples see clearly. Jesus is trying to help the disciples see clearly. What happens in verses 2 and following is not for the sake of Jesus. It's not for the sake of God or for Moses or for Elijah. What happens here is for the sake of the disciples. And so, beginning of verse 2, he says, and after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John. And this is the trio that seems to be the inner circle, the closest of the disciples to Jesus, who have had already the opportunity to see things that the others didn't. You remember when he healed the daughter, that he took Peter, James, and John with him into the house. These 3 were privy to some things, some private miracles that the others weren't, and this is one of them. And, we talked about last couple of weeks about how that when Jesus asked, who do people say that I am? And then he said, but who do you say that I am? There should have been a different answer, especially from Peter, James, and John, because they'd been there throughout the ministry and they'd seen all of the miracles that Jesus had performed. They'd been there through all of that. So Peter, James, and John are going to continue to be that trio that is closer to Jesus. You know that whenever eventually we get to the Garden of Gethsemane, the disciples go with Jesus, but it's Peter, James, and John that he takes further in. I've always thought that there's lots of good that we could talk about the character of Andrew, but one of the things that I think is so remarkable about Andrew is that he's the one that brought his brother Peter to Jesus, and here's these other 2 guys that, they were in fishing business with each other, and Andrew must be thinking, hey, what about me? Those 3 guys get to go everywhere with you, but you're leaving me behind. But he never seems to complain or gripe about that. But he takes Peter, James, and John, and he leads them up on a high mountain. And there's some debate about which mountain that this was in particular, but the real interesting thing about this fact that it was at a high mountain that this took place at is going to be in some of the details of what's going to happen in the next few verses that we can look back in the Old Testament and say, yeah, that reminds me of, and that reminds me of, and that reminds me of all events that happened up on top of mountains. And it says that he was transfigured before them. Now, the word here, transfigured, a lot of people, speculate about exactly what does it mean or whatever. The word is, the Greek word looks and sounds a lot like our English word metamorphosis. It's where we get our English word metamorphosis, which means change. And that's what this word means. Changed in some way that was illuminated or bright or shiny. You remember when Jesus was walking across the sea and he meant to pass by the apostles while they were on the boat going across? You remember that account? And that's back in chapter 6. And they thought that he was a ghost, and we talked about at that time that the word is a phantasm. It's something bright and shiny. Well, it's the same root word that's here. So he was changed. He was in some way he was bright and shiny. And so how was he changed? Well, verse 3 tells us exactly how he was changed. His clothes became radiant, which it reminds us of back in Exodus 34 and verse 29 when Moses went up into the mountain and he was in the presence of God. When he came back down, you remember what his clothes was doing? They were shining. You remember that? From being in the presence of God. So his clothes are shining, intensely white, it says, and I love this next line, as no one on earth could bleach them. So it sounds almost like the tagline from a laundry commercial that you would see on TV. Get your clothes whiter than anyone can bleach them. Use the mountaintop bleach or whatever. So, but it again just kind of showed this detail that Mark's putting in here to make you see that this isn't something that is just, well, suddenly his clothes became very bright. Maybe you've been somewhere at a fun house or something, and you walk in the room with the black light and your clothes will glow a little bit. Or maybe if the sun is really bright and it's behind you and you're between, someone is between you and the sun, and how their clothes kind of washes out or whatever. That's not what's going on here. He's very clear that what's happening is these clothes are brighter than any clothes could be or have ever been in the history of the world. This is something that is different. It's something that's miraculous, okay? And so, verse 4, he says, and there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Now, again, think about this. We kind of talked about a little bit a few minutes ago. If I could sit and have supper with anybody that I chose, whoever it might be, my papaw, John F. Kennedy, George Washington, Ben Franklin, whoever it might be, all of those people that we picked were people that were dead, right? And suddenly you've got dead people in front of you talking with Jesus. So sometimes we just read through these verses and I think we lose a little bit of the awe and the awesomeness of what's going on. So stop and think about that for just a minute. The fact that suddenly you've got these two very famous men in the history of your people that are dead and have been dead for centuries, and suddenly they're right there talking to them. That would have been one of the... Can you imagine the expression on Peter, James, and John's face? What's going on here? And then it's interesting because it says that there appeared to them Elijah and Moses. And here in just a minute, Peter's going to say, this is Moses and Elijah. How did they know that? I mean, it's not like they had pictures of them. They didn't have an illustrated Old Testament that they could look at. I don't know that Topps was making trading cards of famous prophets at that time that they could, recognize. I think part of the miracle of what's happening here is the fact that they recognized. But But here's an interesting point that is a side point. That's not even what this text is about, but it's something that we can learn from it. Whenever we die, guess who we are? When I die, what am I going to be? I'm going to be changed, but who am I going to be? Corey. I'm going to still be Corey. Moses was still Moses. Elijah was still Elijah. They hadn't transformed or changed into something different from what they were. Now, certainly, death is a transformation and a change. But understand, we sometimes say, somebody dies, we say, well, they're gone. Well, no, are we lost so-and-so? We lost Papa last night. Well, we didn't lose him. I know where he's at. And I know who he is. And I know where he is, right? So that ought to be a verse that comforts us to know that even though they're both still dead, they're both still who they were before. And it says they were talking with Jesus. Now, Mark doesn't tell us who or what, rather, that they were talking about. Over in Luke tells us that what they were talking about is they were talking about the fact that Jesus was about to go to Jerusalem and he was going to be raised from the dead. And so that's an interesting conversation that they were having, of course. But here they are talking, and it must have been a surreal moment for Peter, James, and John to be sitting here and not only seeing who's there in front of them, but also talking. Now, I've got an arrow and a line drawn down from Elijah down to verse 11. We'll get to verse 11 in just a minute. But understand that the conversation they're going to have when they're coming down the mountain, down when we get to verse 11, is based on the fact that they've just seen Elijah here. So, verse 5, again, here's Peter being the outspoken one that he typically is. Peter says to Jesus, he says, Rabbi, it is good that we are here. You think? That would be a good moment to be there and to be seeing what they're seeing. He says, Rabbi, it's good that we're here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And your translation may say tabernacles. It's the same idea, a tabernacle or a tent. He doesn't tell us why he thought he needed to make 3 tabernacles or 3 tents, one for Moses and one for Elijah and one for Jesus. Some speculate, and I don't know that this is true, but it makes as much sense as anything else, I guess. But some speculate that the idea of what all's going on here has such a reminder of Moses leading the people out of Egypt in Exodus, what's going on, that maybe he's thinking about the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tabernacles. That was the feast that they would go out into their yards and they would build little tents or covered structures or some kind of... we would call them, remember, some of you are old enough to remember brush arbor meetings, a little brush arbor, little set-up deal that they would live and they would eat in those little makeshift tents. They'd go camping in their yard, basically, is what they would do. And it was a time that they remembered how God took care of them when Moses led them out of Egypt and to the Promised Land, and they were literally living in tabernacles or tents all along. But really what's interesting to what's going on here is the fact that Peter says that we want to make one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. You remember whenever Jesus asked, who do the people say that I am? What was their answer? Who do the people think Jesus was? Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets, right? They thought that Jesus was sent from God, but that he was just like the other prophets that were sent from God. He was a prophet just like the other prophets. Well, notice the way that Peter sees Jesus. Even though Peter made that great confession, here's more evidence that Peter really didn't understand or get what he was saying. And literally what's going to happen is at the end of the Gospels, at the beginning of Acts, it's going to explain to us that the apostles really didn't understand or get it until the Holy Spirit came upon them. But Peter's looking at Jesus in much the same way that all the other people are looking at Jesus. You've got Moses and you've got Elijah, and you've got Jesus, and they were all sent from God, and they're all prophets. He calls him Rabbi, verse 5 at the beginning of this statement here, that first line of verse 5. Jesus is sent from God. He's the Messiah, and he's going to teach us, but in a big picture kind of way, he's pretty on par with these two guys, because when the Hebrew people talked about the Old Testament, even today, they don't call it the Old Testament. They called it the law and the prophets. You'll hear Jesus sometimes refer to that in the Gospels. What is said in the law and the prophets. Well, who represented the law? Moses was the great lawgiver, the one that brought it down from Mount Sinai. And of all the prophets, guess which prophet most represented the prophets in the eyes of the Jewish people? Was Elijah. So you've got three great lawgivers here. You've got Moses, who gave the law. You got Elijah, who's symbolistic of all the prophets, who gave God's communication to them. And then you've got now the Messiah, Jesus, who's now the one that God has sent to reign on the throne and to be the great lawgiver for us. But he's seeing Jesus in much the same way that all of the people did. And then verse 6, we get some clarification about Peter's bad answer. It says, for he did not know what to say. Isn't that the way we are sometimes? He didn't know what to say, for they were terrified. Well, why were they terrified? Charles Latta, there's only one word to describe it. What is it? Big. That's right. That's an Andy Griffith reference. Only one word to describe it. Big. This was a big deal here, right? To be here in the presence of Moses and Elijah and Jesus, to see Jesus transfigured in this way, to be here with all of this going on around them, this was a huge deal. And they're terrified, not only because of how big this moment is, but you remember when they saw Jesus illuminated walking across that water, they were scared then too, weren't they? They thought he was a ghost. So they're scared. And sometimes when we're scared, we start rambling. And sometimes when we don't know what to say, we start rambling. And that's what Peter's doing. And sometimes it's better when we're scared or we don't know what to say to just be silent and not say anything and sit there and learn. But Peter was always the one that wanted to speak up. And so then, while they're terrified, now God is going to clarify what's going on. And so verse 7, a large cloud overshadowed them. So you think about this large cloud overshadowing them on the mountain, and you think about all of these moments, Exodus 13, Exodus 19, Exodus 34, whenever Moses goes up to the mountain, and what is it that symbolizes God up on that mountain? His presence is that cloud. When God leads them out of Egypt, they're following a pillar of fire and what? A cloud. Whenever they complete construction of the tabernacle that God wants them to build, and God shows that it goes through the fact that Moses built this the way God said, he did this the way God said, he did that the way God said, and finally God shows that he's pleased with what they've done because his presence hovers over the tabernacle in the form of a cloud. And then this happens. And of course, I keep thinking about the if I'm Peter and I'm the last one that spoke, and then suddenly the cloud comes over, I'm thinking, oh no, I said the wrong thing again. and that's what is going to ultimately be the case. And not only did the cloud come over them, but it says a voice came out of the cloud. And we've talked about from the very beginning of our study of this book about the fact that seeing and hearing is probably the two most important words in this gospel. How many times that he focuses our attention on what are we seeing and what are we hearing? When we see Jesus doing these things, are we seeing what we want to see, or are we seeing what's going on? When we hear Jesus, are we hearing so that we can counter what he said, or because we're wanting to learn about who he is? Seeing and hearing. over and over and over again throughout this gospel. Well, here's a moment where they can see the cloud and they can hear the voice that comes out of the cloud. And again, it reminds you of like in Exodus chapter 24 when God spoke to Moses from a cloud. And it reminds you of like in 1 Kings 19 when God spoke to Elijah from a cloud. And now he's speaking in the presence of these three disciples. He's speaking in the presence of Jesus from a cloud. And notice what it is that he says here. He says, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." This is my beloved Son, which reminds us of back, we studied a little bit, talked about in Mark chapter 1 and verse 11, that after Jesus' baptism, that same commendation from the sky, from God the Father that happens. But notice he says, listen to him. Now, I usually don't get too technical with the Greek kind of stuff with you, but interesting point about this. This is a present active imperative. Now, what does that mean? Because it's present, he's saying right now, this is when I want you to do this. Okay? Because it is imperative means it is a command. This is not a suggestion or negotiable. This is something you must do. And active means that it's something that you do to or for yourself. See, nobody can listen to Jesus for me. But the fact that this word is set up, this specifically, is very telling. The fact that I want you to listen to him, that's an order. I want you to listen to him now. Not Moses, not Elijah. Now, don't misunderstand. Jesus nor the disciples are going to break the law of Moses or break what's given in the prophets. But Jesus has time and again said, be careful who you listen to. And the problem that the Jewish people had then and have even till today, why, we'll sometimes say, well, how could they not see that this was Jesus as they read through the Old Testament? Well, first of all, hindsight is 20/20, and it's a lot easier on this side to see things than it is as you're going through it. But another thing is the way that they looked at it with preconceived notions and ideas. And we're going to see that as we continue through this text here in just a minute, but they had their mind already made up about what Messiah was going to be. And so they did that and it's not because they didn't study, they knew it, they could quote it forwards and backwards. But they would attribute some things as to being prophecies about the Messiah that wasn't really prophecies about the Messiah. And then they would take things that should have been thought of as prophecies about the Messiah, and they thought that wasn't talking about Messiah. And sometimes we can do the same thing if we're not very careful. So he says, be careful who you're listening to. And so now God's telling them, I'm going to tell you right out who you need to listen to. You need to listen to Jesus. He's trying to help you see more clearly. He's trying to help you understand what you're missing. And suddenly, it says, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them but Jesus only. Moses and Elijah was taken away, and the point of kind of this transfiguration, the main point is that this is Jesus, my son, this is the Messiah, this is the one you're to listen to. But just like Moses and Elijah are taken away from the mountain, what's about to happen here in just a short time, relatively speaking, is that old covenant that God had with the children of Israel, that teaching from the prophets and the law is going to be done away with, and a new covenant is going to be established by Jesus, which again was something that was prophesied to them, right? Jeremiah 31 through 34. In those days I will make a new covenant with my people. I'll write my law upon their heart. They'll be my people. There's going to be a new covenant coming. And And so the old covenant would have to be taken away. Verse 9, and as they were coming down the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen. Here again we have this messianic secret that we've seen over and over and over again, that Jesus is telling them, what you've seen is pretty amazing. And I know if it were me, I couldn't wait to get back down the rest of them and say, you'll never believe what we just saw, you know. But Jesus says, don't. You don't tell anybody what's happened here until, he says, after the Son of Man rises from the dead, which is our second suffering statement from Jesus here in the second half of this book. Chapter 8 and verse 31 was the first one. Chapter 9, verses 11 and 12 will be the third one. But here's our second suffering statement, saying that the Son of Man is going to die. Now, the Son of Man was a term applied to the Messiah from Daniel chapter 7. And the last thing that they thought that the Son of Man, that the Messiah was going to do, was to be defeated and put to death. So, again, this is something that's hard for them to grasp. And so, verse 10 says, they did keep the matter to themselves, but notice what he says here. He says that they were questioning what this rising from the dead might mean. Again, they understood what it meant to rise from the dead. They've been there when Jesus has raised different people from the dead. They understood what rising from the dead meant. They didn't understand him having to rise from the dead because they couldn't understand what this might mean. They still don't understand because they can't comprehend the Messiah dying. And so, as they're trying to figure this out, now how does that fit into what we know about the Hebrew Scriptures and what we know about the Messiah from them? It says in verse 11, and they asked him. Now, again, I've got a line drawn up to verse 4 because they've just saw Elijah, and as they're thinking about how does this fit in with the Messiah and what's going to happen to him, maybe this is some of that prophecy that we know is in there in Malachi chapter 4. And so it says that they asked him, why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come? So they want to know what's just happened up on top of the mountain. Is that Malachi 4? Is that Elijah that coming first that we knew that we were going to see? Well, now we know because remember in chapter 1 of Mark, we pointed out the fact that John the Baptist fulfilled that prophecy, right? That was one of the key things that Mark started this gospel with to prove that Jesus was the one they had been looking for. Verses 11 through 13, though, is going to be talking about who Elijah really is from this prophecy. Verse 12, he says to them, Jesus says to them, Elijah does come first to restore all things. And how is it written of the Son of Man that he should suffer many things and be treated with contempt? So Elijah is going to come first, but the Son of Man is going to suffer. He's going to suffer many things. He's going to be treated with contempt. This is our third suffering statement that we see at the end of this verse. Again, the last one was in verse, back up in verse 9. Chapter 9, verse 31 will be the fourth suffering statement. So again, remember, the first half of Mark, he's saying Jesus is the Messiah. The second half of Mark, he's saying this is what it means to be the Messiah, that he's going to suffer and die. Now, what they were missing was Isaiah 53. Actually, that whole context really starts back in Isaiah 52, where he starts talking about the suffering servant. And they're quoting from Malachi chapter 4. We know Elijah's coming, so you know what the Scriptures say, but you're not getting everything that the Scripture's saying, and you're not focused on all of the things that you ought to be. Really, if you start in verse in Isaiah 52, about verse 13 is where he starts talking about his his servant, and how that he's going to come. He's going to be highly exalted. They're going to be astonished. But then in verse 53, he says right after he's highly exalted, guess what's going to happen to him? He's going to suffer. He's going to be like a lamb led to the slaughter. And that's the part that they weren't putting together with all this. So Jesus clarifies what the prophecy about Elijah is all about. He says, but I tell you that Elijah has come, and they did to him whatever they wanted. Who was Elijah? John the Baptist, right? So if Elijah has come, Elijah was John the Baptist, and they did to him whatever that they pleased. The word is our want, our wish. Who did to John the Baptist whatever they wanted or wished? Herod and Herodias, right? They treated him how they wished. Remember, he asked his stepdaughter, what do you wish? Whatever you wish for, I'll give you up to half my kingdom. She goes to her mama and she says, what should I ask for? What should I wish for? And she said, you go wish for John the Baptist's head on a platter. She comes back and says, that's what I wish for. So not wanting to make himself look bad, because everybody was there, all of the top dogs in the kingdom were there, and they were all listening to what he was saying, not wanting to look bad, he did. He had him beheaded. Elijah's come, and they did to him whatever they wanted to do to him, whatever they wished to do to him, as it is written of him. Now, there's nowhere in the Old Testament, to my knowledge or anything I can find, where it says that this coming Elijah would be punished or done wrong or have to suffer in any way, but it did say he was coming, and that's what Jesus is referring to. He came just like it was said that he would come. He was here just like it was said that he would be here, and this is what they did to him. So guess what they're going to do to me? Whatever they wish. In part because he didn't fit what they wanted him to fit. So the question for us to ask ourselves is, how do we see Jesus? How do we see our place in his kingdom? Are we glad he's the king as long as we understand that this is the way I want things to be? Or are we willing to let him be the king and follow his wish, his rule, and his reign? In other words, do we want to make Jesus the king after the image that we have in mind, or are we willing to make ourselves in his image? Are you with me? How we see Jesus as someone we love, someone we want to claim, someone we want to be a part of, someone that we want to be associated with, someone we appreciate what he does for us, or someone who is Lord and Master and King. There's a difference. That's the difference that the disciples are having to struggle with and figure out. But now, ultimately, if you flip over in your Bibles to 1 Peter, ultimately, when Peter is writing his epistles, he's going to point back to this moment and say, you know, this is one of those moments. Maybe I didn't figure it out at the time. Maybe I didn't really grasp everything that was going on in the moment. But ultimately, when I look back on it, this was one of those moments that helped me understand exactly who Jesus was and exactly the importance of who he is. If you look down in 1 Peter chapter 1 at verse look down at verse verse 5. Who are protected by the power of God through faith for salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. In this greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while it's necessary, you've been distressed by various trials, so the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold. So he's talking about how that they're going to have to suffer. And you're willing to suffer if you understand that your faith is built on something that is really important. And I'm telling you that it is. Verse 8, he says, and though you have not seen him, you love him. And though you do not see him now, but believe on him, you greatly rejoice with inexpressible and full of glory. So their believing, their faith is based on just what they've heard and what they've experienced about Jesus and what he's doing in their lives. But he's going to say how that was all something that was revealed to them, to the apostles, and that's why they were able to speak and to preach in the way that he did. If you look down at verse 10, this salvation, the prophets who prophesied of the grace that would come, seeking to know the person, all the prophets, Moses, Elijah, none of them knew who Jesus was. They're prophesying, but they're not able to figure it all out. Verse 12, it was revealed to them that they were not serving themselves, but you. They recognized that that's why they were writing the things that they were writing, was because it was for them and to help their knowledge and to help their understanding of what was going on. But see, even though at the moment I didn't really comprehend it, now I can look back and I can talk about this Jesus as the fact that he's not just the one that I thought he should be or the one that I hoped he might be. He was above and beyond anything that ever could have dreamed or imagined. And when we see Jesus properly, that's the decision that we'll make as well. That he's greater than all those boxes I try to put him in, or the gospel in, or the kingdom in, is so much greater than anything that I've ever could have dreamed of or imagined. And serving him has greater benefits than I ever could have hoped for. You know, we sometimes talk about, we don't every week announce it, but we often talk about how that the invitation of Jesus is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Jesus says, come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly